Right. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us this week to give us a brief rundown on the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you should wish to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Aknaf, and good evening from Israel. We're going to talk, as the blurb indicates, a little bit about how the American elections affects U.S.'s relationship with Israel, and also within Israel itself. There's a lot of timetables coming up, and they will prove extremely relevant as the weeks and months go on. I would say, as a preface, I'm not an expert, far from it, on US politics, and I'm going to try and not wade in as much as possible to internal American political matters. It's not my place, and it's certainly not my area of expertise. But what I would say in the onset is that both countries are in an election campaign cycle. Only one of them has a fixed date. As we know, the US will go to elections in November. Israel has ostensibly another, or this Israeli government, I should say, has something like another three and a half years of its mandate to go. And as we know, no Israeli government has ever reached its full term. And it's extremely unlikely, I would say almost impossible, that this particular government will reach its term. The big debate in the Knesset, where I was today, amongst many, many different members of Knesset and their advisors and the people who run the parties, is trying to figure out when exactly elections will be. My prediction is the first quarter to first third of next year, and I'll explain the timetable in a little bit. But the major hurdle that Netanyahu has to get through is to see out this summer session, because as I've said before, when he sees out the summer session, then we go into a long break for the summer, followed by the Jewish holidays, and only really get back into the Knesset in full swing around November. So if he survives the next few weeks, which I believe he will, then it's, I wouldn't say plain sailing, I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, but certainly for him, a lot of weight will have been removed from his shoulders. Alongside that date, the last week of Knesset, interestingly enough, again, and I don't think any of these things are coincidences, is when Netanyahu will travel to the US to address a joint session of Congress. He was invited by both houses, Republican-held House, and the Senate by Democratic leader Chuck Schumer. It's an interesting date because it really is in the middle of summer. Many people were guessing for a long time that Israel would go to war with Hezbollah over the summer. Not to say it still can't happen, but I doubt it will happen in any full meaning of the word before Netanyahu goes to Congress, because I think that will probably mean he probably can't go to Congress in the middle of a war where he needs to be here every minute. And also it will certainly displease not necessarily his host, because he is being hosted by the House and not by the US, by the Biden administration, but certainly at the end of the day, the administration is the Democratic leader. It is Joe Biden, and Netanyahu will certainly hope to get the optics of a meeting with Joe Biden, President Biden, when he's in the US. And when asked about that today, I believe some press secretary said that they believe that meeting will happen. I can't imagine that a sitting prime minister of Israel will be in the US and not have a meeting with the US president. The question is how much credit, how much honor he'll be afforded. There are certainly lots of ways for an administration to show what level of warm feeling they have towards someone. exactly what kind of events there are, what kind of honorifics are used, the the optics of the event. But I think one thing will be almost certain is that there will be a sit down, between a direct sit down between Biden and Netanyahu, the first one since the first week of the war, when Joe Biden famously came to Israel and spoke very nicely, and really stood in lockstep with Israel. Obviously, since that time, there's been a lot of disagreements, which have just simply grown. The latest one is about the rearmament of Israel's military during the war. It's clear that some of the shipments have tailed off a little bit. The most obvious one is the 2,000 pound bombs, which the U.S. has said that they're not going to supply Israel. Their argument is that they do not fit Israel's fighting in urban areas. And they claim that because they took this off the roster, it caused some bureaucratic difficulties for some of the other shipments, and that's why they were held up. Netanyahu has claimed in recent weeks that he's tried behind the scenes diplomacy, which hasn't worked. So he has gone public and really accused the Biden administration of not allowing Israel to defend itself and not supporting Israel in kind with the armaments and weaponry. Interestingly, Yoav Gallant, defense minister, was there last week, and it does seem, or at least both sides are now saying, that a lot of the problems are going to be solved, and there shouldn't be any problems from now on in. So those are some of the disagreements. Some of the other disagreements obviously are, Joe Biden with his re-election campaign really struggling at the moment. The last thing he needs is a wider regional war. That's something which he has made it clear, and we hear many other leaders following on, whether it's France's Macron or others, who have basically said that they're trying to warn Israel for not launching a full-scale invasion or full-scale war against Hezbollah, even though today there was a very interesting assassination of one of the most senior military commanders of Hezbollah. Hezbollah have three major regions, which are all run by different commanders. Israel already took out one of them. Today, it took out another one, so there's only one left. And we saw last time when it took out the commander of a region, Israel was on the receiving end of hundreds of missiles all over the north. And so Israel is bracing itself for something like that. The question it remains is, what will come of this? It doesn't seem like Hezbollah want to go to war. They've said on many occasions, and most recently in the last couple of days, that if there is a ceasefire with Hamas in Gaza, then for them, there's also a ceasefire. The question remains is what happens if there's not exactly a ceasefire, but Israel trails or tampers down some of its operations, which it's certainly likely to do in the coming weeks, once it has completely secured and conquered all of Rafah, which it's on the verge of doing, and probably then will move to what has been described as phase 3, which will be smaller operations. Whether that's enough for Hezbollah to come down from its high horse or tree or whatever you like, because it's clear Hezbollah do not want to go to war. They are hurting. And as I've said from the beginning, Hezbollah's main raison d'etre is to act as a deterrent against Israel in case Israel should get any ideas about attacking Iran or Iran's nuclear program. And if there is a full-scale war and Israel deal a bloody nose to Hezbollah, that would certainly weaken Iran significantly in the region. Probably this partly explains why Israeli security officials and commentators are saying that largely a lot of Hezbollah's major forces have now retreated over the Litani River. We know that's a demarcation line. I think it's 10 or 13 kilometers in from Israel's northern border. If we remember, the Litani River is the demarcation line where, according to UN Security Council Resolution 1401, after the Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah was supposed to retreat behind. Clearly, they never did, and they basically just ignored the resolution. But the fact remains is they're obviously worried enough that they are moving many of their forces. Obviously, there are still some forces left, but they are removing themselves. It is clear that Hezbollah do not want an all-out war. Certainly, the Lebanese do not want an all-out war. Israel is in the quandary that at the moment they haven't heard any diplomatic solutions that will give them the confidence that the around 60, 70,000 Israelis can return to their homes, which they were evacuated from October 8th and onwards. Israel is still threatening that it can and will, if necessary, go into Lebanon. I think it was Defense Minister Gallant who said today that our tanks can move from Rafah to the Litani in a very short amount of time, sending a very clear message that it is ready and willing and able to fight on both fronts if necessary. This is something which has been widely debated in Israel, whether Israel has the capability to fight on two fronts, not just whether it has the manpower, but also whether it has the armaments. And there are some who are saying that the fact that the Americans have not necessarily suspended, but certainly slowed down some of those armaments could impact on Israel's ability to fight on two fronts. That's something which has been denied by the IDF, but something which clearly is on the mind of Israelis and certainly will be brought up in any Biden-Netanyahu meeting. Just some other issues at the moment. First of all, as I said, Hamas have apparently responded to the Israel/U.S. offer. At first, they rejected it, but apparently they've now come back with some revisions. And Israel, the Prime Minister's office just released a statement saying that it has received through mediators the offer or the counter offer or whatever it is, and they'll be studying it, and we'll have to see the reactions. At the moment, Israel is certainly saying that even if there is some sort of a yes, it will still involve significant other negotiations. So this is not a hostage deal that's going to be inked tomorrow. A major political quandary also took place this week with the release of the manager of Shifa Hospital. If we remember, Shifa Hospital is the largest hospital in Gaza and was basically the headquarters of Hamas, something which Israel demonstrated to the world, something which Hamas didn't even really try to hide. And at one point, Israel arrested the head of Shifa Hospital for allowing his hospital to become the headquarters, or maybe even, something more active than that, and also to try and get intelligence, because it's clear that some of the Israeli hostages were taken there and some of them were killed or died there. But he was released this week, and there's a bit of a blame game between the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Shin Bet, the IDF, the prison service. Apparently, due to overcrowding, there was a list suggested by the Shin Bet of people that they felt would not return to terror that they could release. His name got on it, and he was released. And there was a lot of clamor for exactly what happened, because while the manager of the hospital may not have been someone involved directly in terror, obviously he was arrested for a reason, and Israelis didn't understand why someone who clearly, at the very least, acquiesced to allowing his hospital to become a terror base shouldn't have been released so quickly under these circumstances. One of the other issues which is coming up this week, which I referred to earlier, about whether Netanyahu really does have the whole summer in the Jewish holidays, is the whole ultra-Orthodox enlistment issue. It's not going away. And while Netanyahu may certainly breathe a sigh of relief when the Knesset goes into a break over the summer, for the ultra-Orthodox politicians, they will not. The reason being because at the moment, because there is no law, and the Supreme Court basically said all 18-year-old ultra-Orthodox men should be conscripted, they should be enlisted into the army, and if they are not, then they will receive personal sanctions, and even some of the religious institutions they attend will also receive sanctions. This is a massive blow to the ultra-Orthodox community, and that's why some of their leaders have gone to America to try and raise tens of, if not $100 million. This is something which is already biting and will just bite even further as the weeks go on. So whereas Netanyahu may think that he has some breathing space after July 28th, the ultra-Orthodox politicians certainly will not. They're already being attacked by their own community, granted more extremist elements within their community, but it's going to only get worse as the economic sanctions bite. So this is something which still Netanyahu has to try and deal with, even when the Knesset goes into a break. Finally, we have some really interesting comments today from former Defense, Foreign Affairs, and Finance Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who's now in the opposition, who basically came out with probably the strongest comments on Iran for quite a while, saying that we shouldn't be wasting time with Hamas, or Israel shouldn't be wasting time fighting Hamas in the south, Hezbollah in the north. The key to this is Iran. Without attacking Iran, Israel cannot achieve victory, because without Iran, Hezbollah and Hamas will simply not be able to fight. He even went as far on Israeli TV and say that Israel should be extremely worried about the fact that Iran is now at the weaponization stage. This is something which analysts and commentators have debated ad nauseum, whether Iran has already enriched enough uranium and whether it's moved to the weaponization stage, which could take between 1 and 2 years. Avigdor Lieberman came out today, and this is someone who sat in the Security Cabinet for almost 2 decades, who says that Iran is already at the weaponization stage. If Israel doesn't act soon, it will be too late, and Israel should be focusing on Iran and, as he said, should be using all options, including non-conventional ones. Now that you don't need me to go any further into what exactly that could mean, but it's clear that it's on the mind of a lot of security officials. While the focus may be on Hamas and Hezbollah, there is concern. The recent IAEA report, the International Nuclear Watchdog, certainly is very concerned about where Iran is in its nuclear program. And we certainly hear for the first time a senior Israeli official, granted not a government official, expressing grave concern about Iran and basically saying that it's about time our attention should be properly focused over there. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Ashley. I will start with a question from Stephen Miller, who asks, there's been conflicting statements on what, if any, munitions the U.S. is not supplying Israel. Can you please clarify?
As I said, officially, the U.S. has said only the 2,000 pound bombs, the largest bombs that Israel has used since the beginning of the war, are the only ones that are being officially withheld. Now, the excuse that the US is giving why that some of the other ones are either being slowed down or not delivered at all or on time is because that they were part of that deal and they just got lost in bureaucracy. It's possible. I don't know exactly how the US bureaucracy works. Could just be an excuse. It could just be something which publicly they're saying and privately they're basically holding it over Israel. Don't forget, this isn't just about Hamas anymore. This is also about Hezbollah. And the question remains, and seems to be something which a lot of Israeli security officials are debating, is whether the US is holding off on some of these munitions, not necessarily because Hamas, because, as I said, the large-scale operations on major population centers, not to say they're completely behind us, but we're now in stage 3 where they won't be as frequent or as large. The question is whether these lack of or suspension or delay of armaments are now to try and ensure that Israel does not go to war with Hezbollah, because it could turn into something more regional. The Iranian leadership have said that recently, that if Israel does launch a full-scale war against Hezbollah, they will force to be involved and they will use all means to fight Israel. So it's clear many countries are calling on their citizens to leave Lebanon, including Saudi Arabia, including US, France, and the UK. So it's clear that the international community feels the pressure, feels that this could happen, but Israel also wants the world to understand that it cannot go back to the status quo, even on October 6th, let alone the situation since October 7th.
Okay, thank you. Now, we have 2 questions here of a similar nature. I'm sure you can answer them at the same time here. The first comes from Eric Selkov, who asks, do the recent EU elections moving towards the right help Israel? And then to follow, Anthony Field asks, how do you expect the UK-Israel relations to change if a Labour government is elected?
I mean, those are two different issues. First of all, the EU elections, the parliament elections, are less relevant than the national elections. They are an indicator of where the public sentiment is. And certainly there has been a dramatic turn to the right. It's not necessarily, well, it's not about Israel, it's about other issues like immigration, and the fact that, we have been in economic difficulties. So usually people do turn to the more populist, whether it's populist left or populist right at the moment. We see a more turn to the populist right. And it certainly will help Israel because it seems the more right wing, unless you're extreme right neo-Nazi, the more right wing you are in Europe, the more friendly you are, more understanding you are towards Israel. And obviously the corollary is also true. The more left wing you are, the more hostile you are to Israel. So obviously having more right-wing members of the European Parliament can only be a good thing for Israel. What we are seeing is also on the national level. We saw in Holland, Geert Wilders elected. We saw a bureaucratic prime minister nominated or even sworn in the last couple of days. But still, Geert Wilders is pretty much still running the show. And that would be unthinkable 10, 20 years ago to have Geert Wilders there. So this is followed up by what's going on in France with Marine Le Pen's party basically winning the majority of constituencies in France. Now, there is a second round, which I believe is taking place next week. And it could be that there won't be as many wins as possible if all the other parties get together and support the opposition candidate to Marine Le Pen. Then could be she won't do as well. But it's clear that the mood is changing in Europe. Where that is also the mood is changing. And again, I think I've talked about this in the past. Elections around the world just are seeking change because of COVID, because of the economic fallout, because of the international insecurity, more to do with Russia and its invasion in Ukraine than what's going on in the Middle East, although it does have an important global diplomatic and economic fallout. But people are seeking change. At the moment in the UK, the Conservative government have been in power for, I think it's 10 years, if not longer. And they are, according to polls, going to be routed at the elections, which I think are taking place tomorrow, I believe. And there'll be a Labour government. Now, this is not the Labour government of Jeremy Corbyn, who is an extreme left, extremely hostile, some would even say anti-Semitic politician. Labour have rebranded itself. They consider themselves more centre-left. They've tried to oust as much of the far left as possible, but many pockets remain. It will be interesting to see that the Conservative Party are even getting close to becoming the third party with, I think the party's called Respect, which is a more right-wing party expected to do well. Again, because of the British system, first past the post, it could be that even if you do well, if you get 20% of the public vote, you can only end up with 2 or 3% of the seats. That's very unique to the British system. But it's clear people want change, and the relationship with Israel certainly will move in a more critical fashion. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, as I said, is not Jeremy Corbyn, but certainly I even think his wife is Jewish, so it'd be hard to describe him as an anti-Semite, and he's certainly not as critical as some of the more left-wing, but he has many of these members in his party. So it's going to take a turn for the worse. It won't be a disaster as it could be, but certainly with everything going on with Israel's war against Hamas, possibly against Hezbollah, and all the other challenges it has, certainly the UK will be less receptive to Israel's challenges. Interestingly, the UK just signed up to become a partner in, I think it's the ICJ, or even no, they were meant to give a position on the ICC potential arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, which has delayed the decision somewhat. That's a very friendly and supportive decision, but that is a decision made under a Conservative government. It'll be interesting to see whether the Labour government continue that, because these types of things are extremely crucial. So it's clear that it won't be as friendly the day after. But on the whole, in Europe, more and more countries are turning towards the right, and that's certainly going to be a more receptive audience for Israel's needs.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to a question from Carrie Hillebrand, who asks, is the Ministry of Defense moving to draft large numbers of Haredim? If so, does the IDF have the capacity to absorb them?
It's not really. I believe that enlistment notices were sent out because legally they have to send them out. But it's a long process. First of all, they'll be ignored. Then they'll probably have to send a second and a third. I don't know exactly how it works. Before then, there are measures taken out, criminal measures taken against them. So that's a relatively long process. What, as I said, is a shorter process is if they do not turn up as requested. By the way, of any enlistment papers, my second daughter just received her enlistment papers, and she has to turn up. If she doesn't, then she faces criminal sanctions. It's true of everybody. But what happens here is the fact that the ultra-Orthodox institutions that enforce the fact that they will not go to be enlisted will face financial sanctions. So that will be the real test to see exactly what happens. And whether the IDF has the capacity. The IDF has a massive manpower issue. I mean, they've lost significant amount of soldiers. Don't forget, as well as the hundreds of IDF soldiers who have been killed since and including October 7th, there's been many who have been injured. I mean, you just have to visit any Israeli hospital and you'll see, I visited one today, and you'll see amputees everywhere. Now, it could be that that's from something else, but I think the large, if not the overwhelming majority, are because of the war. And these people obviously cannot go back and fight. So the Israeli army has lost a significant amount of soldiers. There's a lot of positions in lots of different arenas where they need to fill that. There is all sorts of talk of creating new battalions just for ultra-Orthodox, and maybe bringing them into intelligence, maybe bringing them into all sorts of different positions. But the fact is that the IDF is trying to find solutions for them. They do have the capacity to absorb at least a few thousand, where they can't absorb all those 18-year-old ultra-Orthodox or 19 or 20-year-old who are supposed to be in the army. That's tens of thousands. It would be impossible for them to absorb all of them in one go, but certainly they could absorb a few thousand. But we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens there.
All right, thank you. Now, to close here, we talk a lot about the war and what happens on the actual battlefield, but it seems like people don't really hear about as much about the more than 100,000 people in Israel who have been displaced from their homes and now living under the looming threat of war with Hezbollah. Can you talk a little bit about what life is like for these Israelis that have been displaced?
Well, interesting. It's very different. Those who evacuated from the south are much smaller communities. There were no real big cities. I mean, Sderot was the biggest city. So they were mostly put together, whether it was another kibbutz somewhere else in the country, which absorbed a few hundred from one particular kibbutz, or even a town, or even one I think a community was even put in one very tall apartment block. Some of the communities in the north, like Kiryat Shmona, is a proper city, and they've basically been put all over the country. I read a statistic that said the children from Kiryat Shmona have been put in 100 different educational facilities, which means that they've been spread out around the country. And as opposed to the south, where even though Hamas are still able to send off rockets, and there was a barrage this week, on the whole, they're becoming more and more infrequent. And a lot of the communities, especially in Sderot and other places, are able to return to their homes. In the north, that's not true, and they don't even know when they'll be able to return. We're now officially in the Israeli summer. Educational institutions have finished, so the kids really don't have, of these northern communities, don't have an infrastructure of what to do because they're no longer in school. The parents, some of them cannot work because they're not in their place of work. They can't even visit their homes. There have been examples of families who've snuck into their communities to get clothes or whatever, and they've been attacked by Hezbollah. So it's a very precarious situation, but it really, for the northern communities, what's the worst is it's the unknown. They don't know when they'll be able to come back. And also, if Israel does reach some sort of diplomatic understanding, do they have the faith that what happened on October 7th will not happen on the border? If we remember, Hezbollah was bragging for many years that they'll be able to do pretty much October 7th on the northern border. They'll be able to come across, they'll be able to take over towns and cities. And as I've said many, many times, Hezbollah is a well-trained, well-armed, well-equipped army. It's not Hamas. Hamas is none of those things. And they were able to achieve all that bloodshed and kidnap and everything else. So Hezbollah is a very different thing entirely. And there were a lot of people in the north, very close to the border, who have simply said, we will never return to our homes. We don't have the faith that we will not see what happened on October 7th. So, they did not suffer what the southern communities did on October 7th. They don't have that direct trauma. But now they're facing a different type of trauma, the trauma of the unknown, the trauma of, will they ever feel safe again if they even are able to go back to their homes in the future? So those are some of the things that the evacuated are speaking about. There's been a lot of demonstrations. They want decisions made. Most of them, if you ask them, for what I've seen in polls, want Israel to go in and move Hezbollah physically back. If it needs a war, if it needs a major operation into Lebanon itself, they said that's the only way that they will ever feel safe again. So this is part of the trauma that they are facing at the moment, especially as even today we had a barrage of dozens and dozens of Hezbollah rockets coming across the border.
Well, that is absolutely harrowing. Thank you for that insight there. We have unfortunately reached the end of our podcast for the week. I want to thank you again, Ashley, for taking the time this week to give us an update.
Thank you.
Of course. And for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout over the weekend for our weekly podcast offerings email. We thank you all again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful day. And for those of you here in the United States, I hope you enjoy your 4th of July. Thanks.